Welcome back, everyone. In our last video, we took you through the input section, specifically the Site Inputs tab, where you could change or modify any of the underlying assumptions that would then be calculated in the appraisal functionality. Now, you would most likely do that a few times, maybe iterate through that process, but then ultimately you'd come to a point where you'd be happy with where the appraisal's at and trust that reflected an accurate position. At that point, you might want to then start sharing some information with clients and or colleagues. And now we have a few cool functionalities that allow you to do that in a really interesting way. So we have a download folder with a number of options within this. This includes a fully functional operational financial model that would print out in Excel spreadsheet format. And that would provide all of the underlying assumptions, all the calculations, and show kind of quite transparently how those then result in the outputs that are shown in the Viability tab. There's then a site data download that will take a lot of the information and data from the analytics tabs and put those also into an Excel spreadsheet format. That would be more for if you wanted to kind of copy paste tables or graphs from those tabs into a report. That would be the best way to do so. There's then a detailed appraisal summary download, which is just effectively an Excel version of the Viability Appraisal tab. A site comparison download that would also be an Excel spreadsheet format, which would show a site-by-site, kind of column-by-column comparison of any of the sites that you've toggled on from your saved database. And then lastly, a PDF viability report, which would basically split in two sections, the first half of which kind of detailing the inputs that you've assumed, and that would pick up any of the modifications you've made personally. And the second half of that report would then take you through all of the output sections. So kind of the summary, the appraisal, the sensitivity and delivery sections, with appendices that would set out a lot of the key information. So the most exciting of these, in our opinion, would be the financial model. So we're going to click on that first, and that is going to take a few seconds to generate. The reason being that it's running a bunch of calculations, which allows you to run some really cool sensitivities and scenarios in the model itself. So that should pop up any second, and there we go. So we're going to open up this file, and we're going to enable editing. So the front page is really simple, just a kind of a tab overview. So it'll set out each of the tabs in the model, what that tab does, and how it kind of interlinks or integrates to the rest of the model, with some options to kind of click straight into the tabs if you'd like to. There's then a site info tab, which sets out the site name and address, kind of some key geographic information, and a site location map, a site area table, and then a red line boundary satellite map. Again, if this model is kind of sent out cold, then this is really useful for someone to understand the kind of the context of the site, where it's located, what it looks like, and how big it is. And then we get straight into the outputs tab. So this would be most similar probably to the viability summary tab. It's going to have a lot of the key information, some key site metrics in terms of how many units, the site area, the density, affordable division, percentage of flats, and then the debt funding percentage. And then there's a scenario metrics tab, which will allow you to run sensitivities on any of these three key areas. So percentage of affordable, so the affordable division, the sales sensitivity, and the cost sensitivity. So what you can effectively do is run through and, for instance, go to 10%, and that will update this entire model. So you can see the residual land values go up to £5.4 million, and the peak funding is updated, and everything will have updated. But we're going to go back to the base case 35% just to demonstrate the rest of this model. There's then a viability position, which we've just kind of shown you, which is the residual land value, benchmark land value, if it's viable, and the peak funding. An appraisal summary, which will split this out between GDV, development works, finance, profit, so forth. And then a 10-year by 10-year breakdown, a type breakdown, so if there was flats versus houses, and then lastly, a delivery options table, which sets out that development agreement, that joint venture, and self-delivery options in terms of showing what the funding requirement is, and then what the land value return and share of scheme profit is. If we then go into the appraisal tab, this is that detailed appraisal tab from the viability section. This will just give a bit more information around how the calculations are made. But again, as we mentioned, we downloaded this. I mean, one of the key things that this does do is it shows you, especially for those who are a bit more Excel savvy, it shows you all the calculations. So, we appreciate that, one of the downfalls of a kind of web-based software application is that you lose kind of the power of Excel in that you can't really see how the calculations are being made, where numbers are coming from, and you might lose a bit of trust. So one of the main reasons we wanted to have this model functionality was so that you could go in and look at the calculations, see where they're coming from, how they're being made, how they're being calculated, to kind of offer that next level of transparency and that next level of trust. So again, any of these cells, there are hardly, other than the inputs tab, hardly any hard-coded cells in this model. So everything links through to show you how everything's kind of working. So there's then a cash flow tab, which will show the key profile assumptions, and then the profile cash flow to the right here to give an idea of amounts and timings that have been assumed. A sensitivity tab with conditional formatting to show kind of where viability is either good or bad. A joint venture tab. So for those who are less familiar with joint ventures, this will give you kind of a crash course in how a joint venture is supposed to be modeled in terms of land value being invested, cash, matching cash coming in, debt funding provided, and then how the waterfall is then made. So you can show the repayment waterfall down here. This is a pretty industry standard joint venture modeling that you can go through. And then we also have a self-delivery modeling as well, where the landowner is effectively the developer, where they kind of invest their own land, build on it, and then take all of the land and profit at the end. There is then an inputs tab. So this is fully locked down. So these cannot be changed. And, there's a number of reasons we do that. But mainly the biggest concern is that, you send this on to someone who then changes an input that materially affects kind of the outputs of the model and then sends it on to somebody else. And suddenly the information that you've generated from the app is going to become almost corrupted. So we provide these inputs for kind of transparency's sake, but they actually cannot be changed. Again, which kind of gives you peace of mind that when you sent this out, no one can really go and change any of these assumptions, and they're as intended. Again, so we'll look at the sales rates. It's all the same numbers from the app. The DCF will then flow through into the DCF tab. So all these inputs will be found in this tab. We then next have the DCF tabs. So, and again, if DCF was not assumed in the app, if you, for instance, went with a percentage of market sale instead as an input, then this tab would not be shown. The only reason these tabs are unhidden is because the DCF assumption was assumed within the app itself. But this will set out the key inputs, the sales per unit for the shared ownership, and then we'll show you kind of the resulting cash flow in the tables below for a 1-bed flat, a 2-bed flat, and so forth. And that's the same for the affordable rent and the target. And then lastly, we have the calculations tab. Now, if you were coming into this purely for the transparency kind of perspective, then this would be the best tab to go to, because this effectively will bring in all of the inputs data from the inputs tab, and it will show you in a very kind of easy to understand format how those calculations are then converted into the outputs that are shown in the darker tabs. So you can scroll through here and just get a feel for how these are being calculated. So that is the viability model. So if we just click out of that, I'm not going to save. And then the next probably really exciting feature is the viability report. So I'm just going to click on that. And again, both of these will update as you make changes. So if we were to go and change any assumption in the inputs tab and rerun the viability, all of these downloads would then update on that basis. So it's a really useful way of kind of getting a snapshot of viability and being able to send it on to a client or a colleague to kind of give them an understanding of what the change was and what the impact was. So the cover page is just a kind of a red line boundary on a satellite map with the scenario, text, the username, date printed, and the location of that site. We then have a table of contents, which will take them through each of the sections and the page numbers for each of those sections. The first page is just going to be kind of some really high-level information around the location of that site and some of the key metrics, like the size of it, what the p-tile is, what district it's in, and so forth. Section 3 then goes through the capacity in the mix. So, how many units, what the affordable provision is, what the sub-tenures are, specifically around the affordable, and then the size and the mix of the units. So how many 1, 2, and 3 beds, what the bed mix is, and what the size of those units are. Next, we have the sales and receipts. So what sales assumptions were made for the different tenures. How does that boil down to a pound per square meter rate or percentage of market sale rate? How much square meters are assumed for that tenure, and then how that then equates to a total GDV. So again, a nice couple set of tables that just really provide some transparency around kind of how do we get to 14.09 million pounds. So someone can go through quite easily and do that math themselves if they want to. And then similarly for the development costs, we have each of the key cost headings, the quantity in the first column, the rate in the second, and the resulting costs in the far right column. And then last in the input section, we have the phasing, which just sets out the key cost items, the key revenue items, and then what the profile is chosen and the start and the end date. We then have a viability summary tab, which will then show the residual land value, the benchmark land value, if it's viable or not, and the peak funding, with that really useful viability gauge to give it a view of how viable or unviable that site is. There's then a development appraisal summary, which will kind of give a bit more information around that 4.2 million pounds. So what's the development value, what's the works cost, what's the financing cost, and the development profit, again, on a total pound per square meter, pound per unit, pound per hectare basis. And then dropping it down a level, we then have that same breakdown for the different tenures that have been included in the appraisal, with a graphical demonstration of kind of how strongly or weak performing those tenures are on a residual land value basis. We then have the sensitivity section, so the affordable sensitivity and the cost and income sensitivity matrix below. And then lastly, we have the delivery options, so showing you what the development agreement results are, the joint venture scenario is, and the self-delivery scenario. And then in the appendices, again, because we've chosen DCF inputs within the app for shared ownership, affordable rents, and target rent, this will set out the key underlying assumptions for the DCF calculator, and then what the resulting DCF values are for those units. Again, there's not a lot of transparency that can be provided in a PDF report, but if they wanted more information around these appendices, you would likely point them towards the financial model that we just ran you through, which would have those all in calculation format. And then lastly, we quite usefully have a very condensed, very kind of squashed version of the detailed appraisal. So this is probably one place they can go and get a bit more detail around kind of the overall view of the residual land value and how it's derived, giving us a bit more detail around how many units by tenure, the different rates that are used, and it kind of just brings the full picture into view. So that is the PDF report. We probably not a lot of time in the video to take you through the rest, but I highly recommend if you go through the demo site, you can download each of these sections to get a better feel for kind of what other data is provided. But again, we spent a lot of time on this download section because we wanted you to be able to download information and be able to share it with colleagues and clients in a really kind of neat and interesting way. So please have a go at looking at this in the demo site and let us know if you have any questions.